epistemologists. Today we're discussing the issue of internalism and externalism. And in order to give you a little background on this, I want to start by reminding us of the Gettier problem. So the Gettier problem is the problem that it turns out that the analysis of knowledge that we had a very brief acquaintance with, the knowledge is justified true belief analysis, is deeply flawed, because there's all kinds of counterexamples to it. Cases where we think that the person doesn't have knowledge, even though they have something that we want to call justification. What comes out of the ashes of this Gettier bomb into epistemology are two different approaches to responding to the problem of justification. How do we fill in that justification element in the analysis of knowledge? Internalists think that knowledge requires justification and that the nature of this justification is completely determined by a subject's internal states. More on that in a second. Externalists, though, partly as a result of their reaction against the Gettier problem, think either that knowledge doesn't require justification at all, that knowledge is just a straight, basic kind of mental attitude. There are certain things that you know, and justification is a condition that arises out of our understanding of knowledge, as opposed to one that's prior to our understanding of knowledge. Or externalists think that the nature of justification is not completely determined by internal factors alone. We've seen an example of an internalist view already in the evidentialist view held by Kane and Feldman, and we've seen an example of the reliabilist view, such as one held by Goldman, which is an externalist view. To start off with, what is it that makes a belief internally justified, according to the internalist? There are two main kind of internalist outlooks. One of them is called accessibilism. For the accessibilist, a belief's justification is determined by the believer's reflectively accessible states. So the accessibilist thinks that what matters for my justification is whether or not I have access to the reasons for my belief. If I don't have access to the reasons for my belief, then the accessibilist thinks I don't really have justification, because I can't answer the question, why do you think that's true? Right? In order to be able to answer the question, why do you think that's true? We tend to think that someone needs to be able to give their reasons, and you can only give your reasons if they are accessible to you. The other main branch of internalism is called mentalism. Mentalists think that a belief's justification is determined by the believer's mental states. So the accessible mental states are only a subset of the mental states. Mentalists are a little bit more open. They might think sometimes that states that are not consciously accessible to me could help determine the justification for my belief, even though I can't immediately reflect on these inaccessible mental states. What's important is that they're somehow inside me, right? They're somehow mine, and they're determining my belief in a way that depends on my epistemic capacities. Now, externalists think that beliefs are justified on these conditions. Either if they're caused by states of affairs that make the belief true, if they are dependent on counterfactual situations, states of affairs that make the belief true, if they are produced by a reliable process, and again, just as a recap, a reliable process is one that has a tendency to produce true beliefs, or if they're objectively likely to be true. All of those four different ways in which you can have externalist justification make a strong connection between truth, the truth of a belief, and the belief being formed. So for the externalist, what matters is this kind of causal relationship, or if you like, a nomological relationship between the source of a belief, which is usually a true or a possibly true state of affairs, and the belief itself. For the externalist, it doesn't matter whether or not I have reflective access to that source of my belief. And we'll see an example of this later, and we talked about this already when we talked about reliabilism, but Just remember, there are certain creatures, like, your average garden squirrel, that might have true beliefs that amount to knowledge without that squirrel being able to reflectively access any facts about their perceptual process, or even reflectively consider whether their perceptual process is reliable or not. The mere fact that they have a reliable process is already sufficient for them to have justification on the externalist view. They don't need to meet these additional internalist requirements for justification. That's the externalist view. So one of the things that we haven't discussed yet that this debate turns on, the debate between the internalist and the externalist, is the problem of whether the notion of justification is a term of logic, right, that we can analyze for its conceptual content and kind of extract what the important features are of justification, or whether the term justification is just a placeholder for whatever fits into the analysis of knowledge. Justification is a thing, we're trying to find out what it is, that fills out the true plus belief plus that thing, justification. Now, if justification is a term of logic, something that we can analyze conceptually, then it tends to invoke certain other notions that we are more familiar with, like consistency, inconsistency, implication, coherence. And on that conception of justification, if we can analyze it for its essential conceptual features, then it seems like the externalist analysis is implausible, because all of these notions of consistency and inconsistency, implication, the relationship between our beliefs, and the coherence between our beliefs are notions that seem like they're internally dependent. They're things that we might be able to know about. However, if justification is just serving as a placeholder for whatever the sufficient account of knowledge is supposed to be, which we are yet to discover, that's one of the things we're trying to do, is to figure out what properly fills in this equation, then the nature of justification might be amenable to an externalist analysis, because what we're trying to do is discover what actually generates, what actually fills in that gap between true beliefs and knowledge, and not coming in kind of with a preconception depending on our concepts for what should fit in that slot. And the externalist is in a better position to be able to do that, because the externalist is interested in looking at what the states of affairs are, what the relationships are causally between the way I form my beliefs and what is true, right? The relationships between what I know and the conditions for my knowing. So in a sense, one project thinks that the nature of justification is to be revealed by kind of looking at the way things work. And the other one, the view of justification as kind of a concept that we analyze, is more amenable to an internal reflection on what our concept of justification entails. Now, one further thing that is important for clarifying the relationship between internalism and externalism is distinguishing these concepts, the concept of propositional justification on the one hand, and well-foundedness or doxastic justification on the other hand. Propositional justification is having good reasons for one's belief. This is what Kane and Feldman just straight up called justification, but we'll call it propositional justification. So those are the good reasons that you have for believing, whatever they are. On the other hand, doxastic justification or well-foundedness are the basing of your belief on the good reasons that you have. Sometimes it's called the basing relation. Now, we saw with Kane and Feldman that well-foundedness or doxastic justification is generally a causal relation. The basing one's belief on the good reasons you have, that's a causal idea. Your beliefs are either based because they were caused in that way, or they're not based because they weren't caused by the good reasons that you have. So internalism is typically understood to be actually an analysis of propositional justification, not an analysis of well-foundedness. Internalism is a view that the propositional justification, the good reasons that you have, must be internal to you. Either there must be mental states that make up the good reasons that you have for believing, or they must be states that are accessible to you. All right. So basically, internalism is the view that all of the factors that determine propositional justification are either reflectively accessible states, that is, accessibilism, or mental states, mentalism. Internalists also hold that doxastic justification, which is propositional justification and a basing requirement, something like a well-foundedness requirement, is necessary for knowledge. So internalists think that both propositional justification and doxastic justification are necessary for knowledge. But sometimes that doxastic justification is not going to be, it might not be accessible to you. It might not be a mental state. Internalists are okay with that. And that's one of the things that makes this debate complicated. But they're not okay with the idea that your propositional justification is something that is not internal to you. So why be an internalist about justification? Here are 4 main arguments that I'll try to go over with you. One reason is that if someone asks you, why do you believe this? It seems intuitive to us that you should be able to give a reason why you believe something. If you can't give a reason why you believe something, we tend to think that you're irrational. The other reason is that the externalist stuff, like the causes for my belief, those aren't always things that are accessible to me. They're not reasons that I can give. I can't tell you what my causal relationship is to the truth of my belief all of the time, but I usually can give you a reason why I believe the things that I believe. So my being able to answer the question can't be simply because I have a causal relationship that I can't access. The other reason, kind of along these lines, is that the reasons that I do give for my belief will tend to be things that I'm aware of. Now, an objection from the externalist is that you can't give reasons for all of your beliefs, right? Your basic beliefs may not be beliefs for which you can give justification. If you remember back to Moore's response to the skeptical problem, the response is basically that we have certain beliefs that we can rely on that are basic, like my belief that I have a hand, that I can't give further justification for. And if there are such beliefs, then the internalist might be wrong that I have to have a reason to give for every bit of justification that I have. A further reason that the externalist gives to object to internalism on this line of reasoning is that just because some of our justifications are internally accessible doesn't mean that they all need to be internally accessible. So I can give reasons for many of my beliefs, but I don't necessarily need to give reasons for all of my beliefs. And that indicates that maybe internalism about justification is not a condition that applies to all of our beliefs. Here's another argument for internalism. The concept of justification suggests that concepts like right and wrong, praise and blame, duty and neglect are similar. Justification is a normative term, and so it invites comparison to other normative terms. If you don't have access to your reasons for belief, the internalist might ask, how could you be held intellectually accountable to whatever your epistemic duties are? How can you be responsive to these intellectual duties to be a good believer if you couldn't have access to the reasons for your belief? Now, there's 3 responses that we might give to this. Some of them are responses from externalists and some aren't. One response is that beliefs aren't like actions, right? They're not in your control. So that analogy might fall apart. This is the doxastic voluntarism that we talked about last time. Another response is that we can make sense of being epistemically flawed without this meaning that we are blameworthy. Sometimes our beliefs fail to be justified, but it's not our fault. So the response to this duty-based notion of justification is to say that that analogy falls through. The third response is that a weaker claim than the one that makes justification directly analogous to these other normative concepts is good enough. That weaker claim just says that you don't have access to defeating reasons. So the weaker claim says that justification only depends on your not having reasons against believing something, that you don't have access to defeating reasons. And that might be enough to capture the deontological idea. So there would be cases in which you are justified in believing because you haven't had any reasons against believing. And there are also cases in which you don't have justification because you do have access to some reasons that tell against your belief. This is a weaker claim than the initial claim that we started with, which seems to require both positive reasons for a belief and negative reasons not to be given for a belief. This weaker claim just requires that you have no negative reasons that count against a belief. Now, here's a third argument for internalism. The argument asks us to think about the following case study. This is the case study of Norman the clairvoyant.
You could gaze into the future. You might think life would be a breeze.
So Norman the clairvoyant is someone that has reliably true beliefs about what's going to happen in the future, but has no access to whether or not his beliefs have a causal relationship to the thing that makes them true. He doesn't know whether or not his process is reliable, but he just does have reliably true beliefs.
It's so mysterious to me, yeah.
Our intuition about clairvoyant Norman, if he were in our world, would be that his beliefs are not justified, even if they happen to be true a lot.
Coach said I'm starting guard for the rest of the season. I just have to police the C+ on all my midterms. Oh. Right on. An F?
Norman, we think, must have some positive reason for believing that his beliefs are related in the right way to the truth in order for him to have justification. If he lacks that, then we think he doesn't have justification. The other powerful aspect of this thought experiment is that it puts the reliabilist on a defensive position. The reliabilist has to kind of revise their notion of reliability if they want to make sense of clairvoyant Norman. So reliabilists might say things like, well, around here, that sort of belief doesn't have the right causal relationship, and so it's actually not reliable, so Norman doesn't actually have justification, even though there is a tendency to produce true beliefs. That process doesn't count as a genuinely justificatory process because the causal relationship is skewed. That's something the reliabilist has to say. They have to amend their initial account. So this makes it a powerful reason in favor of internalism. Here's another thought experiment that favors internalism. It's the familiar brain in a vat case. Some call it the new evil demon problem, which is basically the following. Suppose that you have Rene, who's a brain in a vat, and his twin, whose brain is not in a vat, it's actually in his body. Nene is not a brain in a vat. To both Rene and Nene, it seems that they are sitting in an apple orchard enjoying the sunshine. Externalists will say that Nene, who's in his actual body, has justification because he's reliably connected to the truth-causing conditions and he has true beliefs. And Rene does not have justification because Rene is in a vat. And the reliabilists will say that they have different justification, even though it seems like they have no mental differences between them. They have no differences in their evidence. The world seems the same to Rene as it does to Nene, and that seems important to us when we're considering these cases. So the fact that there's no mental difference between the two suggests to us that they shouldn't have a difference in justification. If you get that intuition, then you're an internalist. The response from the reliabilist seems a little bit concessive here as well. So one thing the reliabilist will say is that we have to relativize justification attribution to the way things are in our world. In our world, there aren't brains in vats. In our world, there aren't any Renes. And so when we talk about this other possibility, we've got to relativize our assessment of that possibility to the case that it is a modification of, which is the actual world. We're modifying the actual world case in order to produce this possibility. Rene, who's a brain in a vat, would typically have justification because in the typical case, he'd be in the normal situation, he would have justification. That's where the notion of justification comes from. It's parasitic on the actual case. And so the reliabilist is sort of trying to say the same thing that the internalist says, but for different reasons. They say that our regular case is the primary one, not that it depends on the similarity between the mental states that they're both in. All right, now let's talk about some reasons favoring externalism. Why do externalists think their view is good, besides their responses to internalism above? One strong consideration is that externalists think that epistemic justification is tightly linked with truth. Epistemic justification implies that one's belief is objectively likely to be true, whereas prudential justification or other non-epistemic forms of justification does not. But the likelihood of the truth of one's belief doesn't depend on your mental states or your reflective access. So that suggests that our justification is an external notion. Our justification depends on the likelihood of something being true, and that's not always something that I can know. Now, a response to this kind of argument by the externalist is the new evil demon problem. The new evil demon problem illustrates that that's not quite right. In the new evil demon problem case, you have an individual, Rene, who's a brain in a vat. And we say of Rene that he has justification for his belief because it depends on our actual case. But Rene is not a case in which their beliefs are reliably linked to the truth. So in that case, reliability considered at that world decouples from justification. So it can't be right that the intuition is entirely that the epistemic justification is strongly linked with truth. It's only strongly linked with truth at the actual world, and we relativize to this world. In possible worlds, the truth might be unlinked from epistemic justification. So that tells us that maybe the reliabilist picture isn't quite right. But here's another reason for why externalism might be true. It's the consideration about animals and children and the cognitively challenged. All of those beings seem like they might have justification for beliefs that also happen to be true. That is, they seem like they can have knowledge, even though they can't access the reasons for their belief. Another example of this are reliable true believers that have automatic abilities, who might not have access to the reasons for their belief. One example given in literature sometimes is the example of a chicken sexer. Allegedly, there are people that can tell the difference between female chicks and male chicks, which is important for kind of the meat and egg industry. So chicken sexers do the sorting between the male chicks and the female chicks. And chicken sexers, as the story goes, can't tell you what it is that makes a female chick different from a male chick. They can just kind of tell the difference, but they can't explain to you what the difference is. They just have this ability and a natural kind of recognition capacity that they can't share with you. If chicken sexers really can do this, and they really do have knowledge as a result of having these skills, then it seems like they have good reasons for belief that they can't access. The internalist response to these cases is to say that either they actually do have internal justification after all, in spite of what the externalist wants to say. So for example, children have experiences or memories that support their belief, even if they can't report these experiences or memories to you. Same thing with the squirrels or the elderly grandmother who has dementia. They do still have some reasons that support their belief, even if they can't tell them to you. If they genuinely don't have these reasons, then they don't have justification, is what the internalist would say. So what the internalist is saying is that secretly these are cases in which the internalist requirement for justification is met, and we just have to investigate. And the chicken sexer case is similar. If the chicken sexer really doesn't have even any perceptual accessible reasons for their belief that maybe they can't report, then the chicken sexer doesn't have a justified belief, even if they're really, really good at sorting between the chicks. They have some skill that doesn't amount to knowledge. So the internalist is going to go back and say, no, it is a case in which our analysis still works. Now, the final and perhaps strongest reason that I've seen given for why adopt externalist views about justification is that externalism is better at responding to the skeptical challenge. If you think back to More's response to Cartesian skepticism, it's an externalist response. To say that your basic beliefs don't need justification is to say that you are connected to the world in such a way that you can rely on your beliefs, whether or not you know why you can rely on your beliefs. And externalism gets us out of some ways of conducting the skeptical argument. Now, that doesn't mean that the internalist doesn't have additional things to say about the skeptical problem. They do. There's a couple of different internalist views such as abductivism, which is a view about inference to the best explanation, that common sense internal justification can give you enough reason to adopt non-skepticism. That's just one example. That's not to say the internalists don't have responses to this problem, but just that externalists have a more automatic, more wide road for responding to skeptical challenges. Right, so in summary, we've looked at 4 reasons in favor of internalism and some responses to those reasons. And we've looked at 3 reasons in favor of externalism and some responses to those reasons. Internalism and externalism are large issues that underlie the issue of what the right analysis of justification is. And we've seen the connection here to whether justification is a notion that we can analyze on the basis of its pure accessible meaning or not, or whether justification is whatever is that is going to fill out our account of justified true belief, and that we have yet to discover what that is. It won't be analytically discoverable necessarily. We're going to have to go out and look for it in the examples. Now, the other thing that will end up being important, and this is the connection I want to make to our reading for next time and kind of the main issues we'll be considering next time, is something called the regress problem. We haven't talked about the regress problem yet. The regress problem says, suppose that I claim to know some proposition, for example, that there are turtles in the pond. We can ask, how do you know that there's turtles in the pond? I answer, I have justification for believing that there are turtles in the pond. For example, I have perceptual evidence that there are turtles in the pond. And then we ask, how do you know that you have justification for believing that you have perceptual evidence that there are turtles in the pond? And I respond, well, I have evidence that my perception works. And then we ask, well, how do you know that you have justification to believe that you have justification to believe that there are turtles in the pond? And so on ad infinitum. The regress problem is basically the problem that for any reason that I give you for believing, I can ask of that reason, what reason do you have for believing that? And we'll just basically go on to infinity. Internalism and externalism have different responses to the regress problem, just as they have different responses to the Gettier problem. Next time we'll look into more detail what these different responses are. The main responses are foundationalism, coherentism, infinitism, and skepticism. Foundationalism is also a view about epistemic justification, and there are internalist and externalist versions of foundationalism. Just as a preview, Descartes has an internalist foundationalism, and Moore has an externalist foundationalism. But there's also, separately from those, a view called coherentism about epistemic justification. Coherentism says that our beliefs are justified by their coherence with each other. We get to keep a belief if it fits in well with the other beliefs that we have, and if it doesn't cohere with them, then we don't have justification for believing it. Coherentism, according to Bonjour, is a version of internalism. It's compatible with evidentialism. So we've got 2 different internalist responses to the regress problem, the foundationalist response and the coherentist response. And we also have an externalist response to the regress problem, the externalist foundationalist response. The other 2 views that I won't talk about now, but I'll talk about next time, are infinitism, about epistemic justification, which says that the justification chain just goes on forever. And that's fine, and that doesn't defeat our justification. And skepticism about epistemic justification, which says that beliefs just can't be justified without a doubt. So next time, we'll look at this dimension of the debate about the structure of justification. So I look forward to discussing that with you. Stay safe and have a lovely week.